Welcome to today's virtual Lunch and Learn. This is a panel discussion on supplier governance and risk management presented by Iceberg and RSA. My name is Glenn Gower from Iceberg, and I'll be your moderator today. Every organization is under pressure to build revenue, drive out costs, and find efficiencies, and suppliers and third parties are crucial to those goals. In a lot of cases, organizations are being held back because they don't have a full understanding of the risk that suppliers may represent and where supplier risk fits within a broader business context. We're going to hear today about two organizations, RBC and Aetna, who are developing more mature supplier risk and third-party programs. Some of the key questions that I hope we'll be able to address today include, why is effective supplier risk management so critical to success? What's driving the need for greater maturity? How do we get started? How does an organization get on the right foot to start the journey? What are some of the key challenges for building an effective program, and how can we address these? And what's next? Where is supplier risk management going? And what are some of the industry trends and drivers? Throughout the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. Just look for the Q&A pod on your screen. We will try to get as many of those answered as possible during the event. And we are recording today's event, and at the end of it, I'll be sharing a landing page where you can download a presentation deck, a video recording, and there'll be some links to some other related resources as well. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to today's panelists. On the line today, we'll go from left to right, we have Darren McCubbin. He has over 15 years experience in the financial sector, specializing in supplier risk management and procurement. In his current role, he is responsible for the strategic design, execution, and implementation of a new global supplier risk management application for RBC, and he joins us today from Toronto. Welcome, Darren.
Thanks for having me.
Jonathan Swanson leads the supplier management services team at Aetna. That's part of the procurement organization there, and this team is responsible for various performance, risk, and compliance programs and manages the tools that support them. He joins us today from the New York City area. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hello.
Marshall Taburin is RSA Archer's GRC strategist for enterprise risk management, providing strategic input and advising customers on best practices in a variety of risk management areas, including supplier risk. Previously, Marshall held senior positions at financial organizations in risk and audit roles, and he joins us today from Kansas City. Welcome, Marshall.
Hello, everyone.
And John is a senior GRC consultant and one of my colleagues here at Iceberg. He's focused on the finance and banking industry primarily and has 2 decades of experience working with enterprises on a variety of IT and business process projects relating to governance, risk, and compliance. John joins us today from Toronto as well. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here.
John, I actually want to start with you because I think to start things off, it would be useful to actually define GRC and supplier risk management. So I'll turn things over to you.
Okay. Yeah, it's quite a broad subject area, and as a result, the definitions can be very, very high level and vague. But loosely speaking, we want to define GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Governance being, how does an organization, how is it structured and managed in order to achieve its strategic goals? Risk management is about predicting and managing risks that affect the achievement of these objectives or goals. Compliance, of course, is following policies, procedures, laws, regulations that might be in place for your country, state, province, industry, any number of those. Taken together, GRC is about synchronizing the information and activity across all 3 of these areas in order to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of an organization and ultimately to be able to better understand the risk in a business context. Now, when we get into supplier risk or vendor risk management, it's, again, high-level definition would be it's a process for identifying and decreasing potential business uncertainties and legal liabilities regarding the hiring of suppliers or vendors, third parties, fourth parties, etc. It's really involving integrated risk management. When it comes to vendor risk or supplier risk, Integrated is really the key word here, because really supplier risk involves all three of these areas, as you can see on the Gartner chart here. So what this slide is really showing is it's really just using the data and turning it into a true intelligence model. So we want our data to be trusted, aggregated, and transparent. That's really important. It's not just reams of data. Obviously, it needs to be presented to the appropriate levels, board, executives, and management. They need to be able to make decisions based on this information that are informed, confident, and effective. That's become kind of our motto whenever we're implementing any kind of GRC program, is really trusted, aggregated, and transparent risk data for business leaders. And as you can see here, enabling them to make informed, confident, and effective decisions.
Marshall, I wanted to jump over to you, and there's a lot of interest in supplier risk right now. I think, as evidenced by the number of people we have tuned into today's event, I think we have close to 200 people who registered from all sorts of different industries in North America. Wondering, why is there so much interest in supplier risk? Why is it top of mind today? Marshall.
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. First and foremost is really just the general growth in outsourcing that organizations are doing. They're either outsourcing parts of their operation or they're actually delivering third-party products and services, then marketing those services as their own when they're really being supplied by a third party. So the sheer growth of outsourcing to third parties is causing more and more organizations to take a look at the risks that they have related to that. But almost in the news every day, there's third-party incidents that get reported. Either a third party's going out of business, or they've had some kind of disaster or interruption that interrupts the organization's operations or the delivery of their products and services. You've got third parties that have been involved with child labor and Foreign Corrupt Practice Act violations, and you've had a lot of information security incidents where organizations have been breached as a result of gaining access through the third party, or just because the third party is holding their information or their customers' information, and the third party has been breached. So a lot of issues there, and then to make matters worse, particularly in the financial services industry, the regulatory bodies are intensely focused on this problem and have been intensely focused on this problem for at least 10 years, going back to the introduction of Graham-Leach-Bliley and PCI in the United States and elsewhere, and now GDPR in Europe is going to have an impact from a regulatory perspective. So there's a lot of pressures out there on organizations to look at this problem and to make sure they manage it well so they don't have a material problem themselves.
And Marshall, you provided some of this information here to us, just different areas of supplier risk, and I'm sure this may just be the tip of the iceberg when it comes to some of the areas of risks that are top of mind right now. I don't know if you wanted to add any context to this slide.
Well, the only thing I really would say here is that, every organization that's practicing risk management will have identified the different kinds of risks that their organization is exposed to. This slide really represents risk categories or large sources of risk. The point about third-party relationships is that you cannot distance yourself as an organization from the risk associated with a third party. If the third party goes out of business or they violate the law, then you're going to be held liable for it. And many of these risks you cannot transfer through contract. You're stuck with it. And even if you can transfer it through contract, the third party may not have an adequate financial wherewithal to actually compensate you, or there may be limits in the contract to the amount of compensation you can receive back from the third party. So I think the takeaway on this is, if you think you've got this risk directly, you also have this same risk indirectly through your third party or even through their third parties and fourth party supply chains.
That's probably a good setup to the next part of our conversation. I want to bring Darren and Jonathan in here. I'd like you to give us an overview of your roles, what supplier risk management means within your organizations, and where your groups fit into the bigger picture of risk management in your organizations. Let's start with Darren first.
Sure. Thanks, Glenn. So within RBC, I'm with the Supplier Management and Governance Group, and that group sits under finance. We are not part of procurement. However, we are heavily partnered with them, and we eventually roll up into the same finance departments, but we operate separately from procurement and perform a second line of defense. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the first, second, and third line of defense. And the group I'm with, SMG, is fully entrenched in this second line of defense, whereas procurement here plays a bit of both a first line and a second line. So there's always questions around where we fit in and how we tie into procurement, so I just want to be clear that in our world we have actually separated those two functions, and that was done by design. We are currently a small team, about 10 people, and the team itself is about 6 years old. We started out with 2 people, myself and one other individual, and over the 6 years we have grown both in people but also in scope. And really the important thing for us at the beginning in particular was more about education and awareness, and a lot of the questions that we dealt with were, why are we doing this? Do we need to do this? What's the value? And over the years, what we've seen is the real change to those questions are now changing to understand why we're doing this. How do we do it better? How do we do it more effectively? How do I get it earlier in the process? So when you think of how we fit in, we are trying to fit ourselves into the earliest part of that process as possible. From an organizational structure, I mentioned we're under finance, and the reason for that is we don't play a role within the actual business like an operational risk group. So we don't have embedded individuals, and again, that's partly by design, so we keep that second line of defense very, very clear. So I'm not sure if you want me to expand further on where we fit into the organization. As far as what it means to RBC and what this team means, as I mentioned, it's really about that awareness and education about the risk of third party and the maturity across that organization.
Okay, well, there's a few things that I definitely want to dig in on, but I want to give Jonathan the mic. And Jonathan, same thing for me, a bit of an overview of your role in supplier risk management, where that fits into the organization at Aetna.
Sure. So I lead the Supplier Management Services org. We sit within procurement, which does sit within finance. We used to be in the operations group. We recently moved over, so definitely a lot of different drivers and questions that get asked in finance versus operations. But you know, in addition to executing different compliance and performance management campaigns, the real mission of our team is to enable our relationship managers or the people at Aetna who are managing our suppliers to minimize risk and maximize value in doing business with these third parties. So, you know, that really means providing them with the tools and the training necessary to do so. You know, we function as what I'll say, the conduit between our suppliers, our relationship managers, and the other areas that are interested in supplier risk or supplier management. And those might be our, you know, security organization, our compliance organizations, business continuity, you know, so on and so forth. And we operate as a center of excellence. So, you know, our team doesn't own any risk. Our global security or enterprise risk management or so on, they don't own any risk. The business units own the risk, right? You know, they own the P&L. They should own the risk. And it's our job to ensure that, you know, they understand how to identify and manage that risk, right? So we're very involved in the day-to-day, but, you know, at the end of the day, you know, the business unit who owns the contract owns the risk.
Darren, big question for you, Darren, why is getting a handle on supplier risk so critical to your organization?
There's many reasons. obviously, regulatory requirements play a significant role in that, but beyond that, it's a sound business practice that come with it. When you're, we were talking about earlier about the risks being identified, all the different risks and the challenges of sharing information with fourth parties, just the sound business of protecting both RBC and our clients of RBC, the information where it goes. We are constantly, like any organization, we are looking at different ways of doing business. Outsourcing and using third parties are one of those ways. So in order to protect ourselves and our clients, it just makes sound business practice. There is also regulatory requirements, because we are a global organization that we deal with, that require us to do certain activities and certain functions as part of that. And also, when you look at how business is changing, we talked about the outsourcing, but also when you look at some of the new fintech companies that are coming in, these are young startup companies. They don't have a lot of controls around them right now. We need to understand that, and we need to understand who we're doing business with in order to make a more sound, informed decision. We've also seen the information that we've retrieved as part of our supplier risk management program actually alter how we do business and interact with third parties. We've seen our contracts change as a result of information that we've gained through our supplier management practices and our due diligence practices that we have.
Okay. Jonathan, same question to you. Why is supplier risk management so critical to your organization?
Yeah, to echo Darren, our suppliers and our other third parties, right? So, at Aetna, we not only have suppliers, but we have providers that are providing services to our members. We've got delegated entities. We've got brokers who are selling our products. But, all of these types of third parties are becoming much more critical to our operations, right? When our member picks up a phone, there's a good chance they're going to talk to one of our suppliers. And I think the numbers that were shared in the beginning of this presentation kind of speak for themselves. Most of your breaches are happening with third parties. Executives are paying more attention to the headlines, and what we're seeing is that it's becoming more of a pull from the business lines than a push, right? So, I've seen the work that we do kind of evolve over time as a, compliance program where we were pushing requirements onto the business units. But now, we are a service. People or different organizations are coming to us and asking us for assistance in managing their suppliers, and we're operating the way we have for a while, and they want more. They want more help in managing a risk, more help in identifying a risk, and it's becoming a core part of the business operations instead of just a compliance program.
Sure. I wanted to talk a little bit about RSA Archer. You guys still hear me okay? I just had a glitch on the line.
Yep.
Okay, good. Both organizations have implemented RSA Archer as one of the tools in your toolbox for supplier risk management. I just pulled together on the screen some of the common use cases that solution is deployed for. Jonathan, just to what extent does this reflect how you might be using Archer, and are there any other use cases that you've been able to address with the tool, specific to supplier risk?
Yeah. Yep. I think the first one is the biggest one, right? So I mentioned before how we have all these different organizations interested in third party in supplier risk, and we found that we were all using different systems to do that, right? So we're using the same data, and we're talking about the same scope of entities, but we're doing it in different systems. We're asking people to give us information multiple times. So centralizing all of that data and all of the processes into one tool was really a big win for us. But we've also opened this up as a portal for our relationship managers, right? The folks who are managing our third parties. This has become a big workflow tool for us in managing some of these compliance campaigns or risk management campaigns and communicating with the hundreds, if not thousands, of different people within the organization that are managing our third parties. We've also taken it a step further and built out a whole performance management workflow, right? So, performance risk is one of those categories that's important to us, and we've leveraged Archer to build out our performance management program in Archer as well.
Okay. There's a great study that Ernst & Young released last year, about 6 months ago, and it was a comprehensive review of third-party management for financial organizations. And I think it really speaks well to the complexity of the volume of the supplier ecosystem. And they sort of charted how many suppliers are in an organization's inventory population. I had two parts to this question. I want to get an answer from both Darren and Jonathan. First of all, where roughly would your organizations fall? And also, what is in scope for your program? Darren, maybe we'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, sure. We are definitely in the 6% there, the 30 to 50,000 suppliers. As far as what's in scope, no, they're not all in scope. We're looking at a risk-based approach, and we are starting with those suppliers that make up approximately the top 85% of spend, which puts us in the 800 to 1,000 range. I fully anticipate those numbers will increase and the scope will increase as we mature. As you mentioned, we've just recently launched the Archer application. So as we mature in our capabilities and our understanding of Archer, and we get more and more in there, I expect that scope will increase. It'll never be the full 30,000. I don't think that is an attainable goal. However, I think we could expand it probably to the top 90%. It would be a more holistic target we'd be looking at.
So you've done a prioritization based on different risk factors, or how do you come up with that?
Yeah. So we've had a supplier risk program in place for a number of years now, and so we're leveraging that program where we've identified what we had termed our material suppliers, so our higher risk, more critical, important suppliers, and those suppliers are where we've started with. We've also have another program, a supplier relationship management program, where we have tiered our suppliers based on relationships, not necessarily risk, although risk is a component, but more about the relationship side of things, looking at innovation, looking at capabilities and performance versus actual risk KRIs. So we're leveraging both programs to provide that identification, and again, looking at spend is an obvious one to start with as well. Generally speaking, your more critical suppliers that you're dependent on are going to be the ones that you tend to spend more money with. It's not always the case, but it's a good place to start.
Could I add in a comment on that?
For sure.
I think I agree with the spend bit, but for organizations that are just starting up, they don't necessarily have that spend information. They could have, older vendor relationships that perhaps they're paying some kind of maintenance on, or they're paying nothing at all, depending on the relationship. But they still have to identify those kinds of relationships, so they can't look at the P&L statement in order to find them. I don't know if you guys have any comment on how you would find them if they don't show up in the P&L.
Yeah, and there's certainly other avenues that we've explored. As I mentioned, we've had a supplier risk program in place for a while, so we've also leveraged the other centers of governance or second lines of defense, like privacy, IT risk, business continuity. I think it's been touched on a little bit, and it'll probably be touched on a little bit later as well, is there are many different groups that touch suppliers for different facets and different pieces of information. So we've leveraged those groups as well. So from a business continuity perspective, what suppliers that they have assessed are on their list as the most critical suppliers, and are they on our list? Because maybe you're right, they don't come in the top 85%. right, from a spend perspective. So we've leveraged that in multiple sources, not just spend. I want to be clear on that. There's multiple facets in place. You can leverage procurement. You know, who are you doing business with from a procurement standpoint in your RFXs? What suppliers are you seeing come through most often from an RFP perspective? Right? There's many different sources that we can leverage.
Thanks, Darren. Jonathan, just a quick comment on the size of your population and what is or what isn't in scope for your program.
Yeah, so for the enterprise, we fall into that second category, 10,000 to 29,000. But for those that we're tracking in Archer, it's well below 10,000. And we also have a segmentation process where we take 4 risk factors, 4 value factors, metrics that we get from different places, spend, criticality, IT security risk, and we take a risk-based approach and focus on those that fall into the highest risk, highest value categories. Just commenting on that, looking at the P&L or looking at the dollars out the door, we're actually able to leverage contract data as well, right? So how many individual services or how many different individual schedules does a supplier have with you? What's the total contract value over the course of, the contract effective time, right? So you may not have, a high amount of dollars out the door, but that's a high value contract over the course of years. So we're able to look at that as well.
Okay. I wanted to bring up another stat from that same Ernst & Young study just to support the next part of our discussion. It's around who should own supplier risk management in an organization. And Jonathan, you already had touched on that a little bit earlier in the call, but I wanted to give Darren a chance to weigh in on this one. Who should own supplier risk management? And do you see that idea of ownership changing as the risk maturity, the program maturity might grow?
No, actually, as Jonathan was talking, I was checking things off, and he pretty much every point that we are as well, and I agree with him completely that in our world, the business always and will always own that risk. We, from a supplier management governance team, do not own that risk. It's always with the first line. I don't see that changing at all. With respect to some of the other points, and if we go back just a little bit, just some of the points that Jonathan was talking about, why we're doing this, ask once, use many. That was a big driver for this as well. And the centralized supplier inventory, all those things that Jonathan mentioned, we are doing the exact same things to try and get our hands around this. If I look specifically at these charts here, we operate very much, again, as Jonathan was saying, as that enabling arm. So the businesses need to accept that they own the risk. They need to understand what's involved with that, and we're here to help them understand what they need to do, how to identify the risks across that engagement or that supplier, and what due diligence needs to be done. So to answer your original question, no, I don't see it changing. It'll always be the business from our perspective.
Okay. Jonathan, anything you wanted to add? I mean, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to Darren's points, the business does always own the risk. We get involved in helping them identify the risk at different times, and we bring other organizations in as necessary, and it varies, right? There's I look at it 2 ways. There's pre-contract and there's post-contract, right? So what are you doing to vet the supplier before you bring them on? And the involvement of different organizations might be greater or less as time goes. I think, the largest one, and I think we see this across all industries, is, IT security and companies that are that you're sharing your data with. There's a high level of scrutiny that's happening, and we've got a very robust program to help identify that risk, but, once those risks are identified, it's up to the business to either accept them or, work with the supplier to mitigate them. The same thing goes after the fact, right? So once you have an established supplier, what are you doing on an ongoing basis to ensure that some of those other types of risks aren't popping up, right? So how are they performing? Are they meeting the contract terms? What's the financial stability of the company, right? Are you monitoring to make sure that the viability of that supplier as a company is they're not going to go under and have you potentially have a loss of operations, right? Those are some of the post-contracts risk management that we allow our business units to do, right? We monitor it, we help identify it, but at the end of the day, they own it.
Okay. By the way, sorry, go ahead. Who's that? That's
sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Glenn, I was just going to say, based on observation, what we frequently see in some other organizations, usually smaller or less mature, is this evolves out of an IT risk program. Because IT risk is usually the ones that start the risk programs within a company, and by default, they tend to own a lot of the risk programs. But it is absolutely critical to get more mature to transfer the ownership, as it's been mentioned, onto the business side. And I think we'll be speaking about smaller businesses on how to handle risk programs as well.
Yeah. Also a good segue to the next thing I was going to ask, which is about, we talked a little bit, Marshall touched a little bit on some of the external regulatory forces that are pushing the need for better supplier risk management. But I wanted to dive in a little bit more at both of the organizations around, who on the inside is pushing for greater maturity? Is it coming from your senior management? Is it coming from your business leaders? I mean, it might be all of the above type of question, but what's really driving this push for more efficient or more mature supplier risk? Maybe we'll start with Darren on that one.
Yeah, thanks. I think you actually hit it when you said it's an all the above. I touched on it earlier in the introduction that when we first started down this path with the SMG group, there was a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance, and the questions were all around, why do I need to do this? What's the value I'm going to achieve from this? So when you look at what actually was driving it at that point in time, the real driving was the internal expertise that was in existence in certain parts of RBC. That as people moved around and as knowledge shared, that start to expand across the enterprise, and that internal drivers really is what started the group off. Then we get into the regulatory requirements, as we touched on, and senior management requirements. Those really kind of provide you that extra hammer, if you will, as to why you have to do this. From our perspective, we really, from a supplier management governance perspective, we really try and stay away from that, and it's more about the value that we can bring and how we enable people to make better decisions, more sound decisions, and ensure that we are protecting both RBC and our clients. So it is an all the above answer. I think as we have matured over time, what's driving it now is the businesses that are driving it. They need to understand, and they know they need to understand the risks that are being posed whenever they bring a third party on board. They know that they need to manage that, and they want to know how they can do it and how they can do it better. And that's the maturity. It's been a fun process from that perspective and seeing that maturity come across. But yeah, that's the drivers.
Okay. Jonathan?
Yeah, I would say, as far as who's driving it, senior management or regulators, it's head to head, right? So as time has gone on and we have outsourced more things or use suppliers to perform certain functions, whether it was a business owned decision or a corporate initiative-led decision to outsource something, business units are realizing that there needs to be more rigor or there should be more rigor around the way you're managing risk as it relates to your suppliers. But Aetna falls into that sweet spot where we get it from both angles. We get it from the healthcare perspective, and we get it from the financial services perspective. So we are a very regulated company. We do a lot of government business. So when it comes to Medicare and Medicaid and, the business on the, Obamacare exchanges, right? There's a lot of regulation that comes from those that impacts a lot of what we do. So internal, external, I would say it's the perfect storm.
Everything coming together.
Absolutely. And if I could just comment on one more item, there was a comment before about how a lot of risk programs evolve out of the IT security area. What I'm seeing happen now is that, we had a robust risk management program in the IT security area. We had our own risk management program in, procurement and the traditional vendor management operations, and those are converging now. Right, my key peers are the folks in global security that are performing their risk management functions on our suppliers. So, when I said before we operate as a conduit, we truly do. There are a lot of different risk programs that are converging now that are interested in supplier risk.
Okay. I brought this slide up because I told John I would ask him this. We're about halfway through the session here. I want to be cognizant that RBC and Aetna are both relatively large organizations, and I know we have a lot of smaller and medium companies who are listening in on the call today, and, they might be thinking this is too complex or this is just going to take up too many resources. It's going to be something tough to get off the ground. John, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about some of the keys or some of the advice that you would give to a smaller organization. Where would you recommend that they start to develop, take those first steps towards developing a more effective supplier risk program?
Sure thing. Yeah, it's very common, and it can be a very daunting task if there's minimal or a very immature process to face that head on when you're seeing presentations like these that are usually put on by the big consulting firms or large enterprises. But obviously, you're going to need stakeholder buy-in, and the best way to get buy-in is to get them to weigh in. When we come on site with a lot of organizations, and they have been small and large, we try to encourage the stakeholders who may be executives, they may be the operations folks, it could be centers of governance, but to really be involved from the very beginning, the selection of a tool, defining processes, and even right through to building in various build phases, to have them very heavily involved. When they have a say in the end product or process, they take a sense of ownership with it. It's not just something that's built in a black box and then handed to them, which that doesn't usually work out so well. It helps adjust priorities and goals as well when there's going to be lots of requirements from various groups. They can't all happen at the same time. So a really important step is to establish a vision and a goal. Where do you want to be? It can be relatively vague, but you should have a good idea where you want to end up and some kind of time frame. If this is a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, whatever it is, or to become a certain maturity level, that's fine. But map that out, and then, of course, to have a path mapped out how to get there. We quite often on the Iceberg side come in for some of these sessions for organizations that have their risk programs. They may be spreadsheet based. They may have no workflow. There may be paper floating around everywhere. They just don't know what the first step is. So what we quite often do is come in and do a visioning session, help them understand where they want to be, how to get there, what some things are needed before they even start considering a tool such as Archer, risk taxonomy and stuff like that. As the earlier example, if you have an IT risk program in your organization, now you're doing supplier risk, they're both reporting up to someone. You're going to want to speak the same language to whomever you're reporting up to. So that's really important. Understanding where you are and where you want to be at a little bit more detailed level is speaking to the current mode of operations and future mode of operations, what we call CMO, FMO.
And this really applies to small companies or immature processes, as well as large ones that may have an existing process, but they just want to revamp it. It's looking at Mount Everest and making it the base camp first. So you want to be able to get something in and usable really as soon as possible. If you're familiar with Agile, you want minimum viable product, something that users can touch and use and actually produces. That would be FMO 1. We might have FMO 2, 3, 4, and 5, depending on the nature of the program. But each one of them will expand another ring to the circle. So, I mean, if you think of an analogy, a New Year's resolution, I'm going to run a marathon this year. That's fantastic. But you really need to train to run your first 5K first, and then try a 10K, perhaps a half marathon. But each one of these milestones, you're reevaluating your needs, your progress. Maybe a marathon isn't for you. Maybe you need to slow it down a little bit. But you're always checking your progress, checking your goals, and ultimately building that path to get to your marathon. Same thing applies. I think I covered that.
Well, actually, I thought it might be interesting to hear from Darren, put you on the spot here, Darren. If you could think back to when you were at the start of your journey, what have you learned over the past few months or few years? What advice would you have for an organization that's just beginning, where to start?
Yeah, I think along the same lines, it's that small approach and the early wins. John talked a bit about the stakeholder alignment and the way in buy-in. One of the things I would add to that is really what is their challenge? Many people understand, or maybe they don't understand supplier risk, but what is it they're really struggling with? Is it a bit of education? Is it the tools? Is it the process? Is it the support around it? Really understanding what those challenges are so that when you start your program, you can really address, and that'll only strengthen your buy-in. I think one of the things that I'll say we've done well with our implementation of Archer would be that buy-in and the key stakeholdering that's been done is a lot of communication, a lot of back and forth with our stakeholders in order to get their buy-in, and just having that alone has removed a lot of those potential roadblocks, or at least it's smoothed them out a little bit. One of the things when we first started out 6 years ago is we actually broke the enterprise out. We had a vision or a goal to get to the enterprise view, but we started out with smaller groups within the bank, some that were fairly mature in their supplier management and others that had never heard of it before, and try and bring them together and let people who are already doing it in the business, let them become champions for you and really share their experiences, the values that they get out of it. And it's not someone in the center telling them they have to do this. This is someone like them in the business saying, this is what we're getting out of it. Here's the benefits that you will get. Here's our challenges as well. So as you're developing this, learn from what we've done. But that in itself was a huge, huge factor for us in having the champions within the business.
I want to get to this slide, but before I do, we are getting a few questions from our audience coming in. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can as we go. One is from Brian that I want to get to. It's about, he says, about one-off suppliers where procurement isn't involved in sourcing or selecting suppliers, but obviously they still introduce risk. And how do you efficiently identify and capture those smaller suppliers? Jonathan, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, so, depending on your organization, there's a couple of ways this can be addressed. One of the ways that we've kind of taken a look at this is, we now have a procurement mandate, right? So if you want to contract with a supplier to do something for the company, you've got to come through procurement. So that's one control. I mean, that's a very simple one. But another way to do it is if you have the ability, right, if you have a centralized general ledger, a centralized accounts payable, look at the dollars out the door. Look at where your money's going. That's one way to identify the suppliers. And when it comes to dealing with some of these, international suppliers or suppliers that may not be responsive, two things. And this isn't an endorsement of any sort of products, but, use informational services, LexisNexis or Dun & Bradstreet, and do your own research on these suppliers. You can find out different risk indicators. You can find out different information about the companies through these services. And if they continue to be unresponsive, that's where your risk management program comes in, right? If you want to continue to do business with these suppliers, here are the risks that you're taking on by, engaging with a supplier that will not attest to A, B, or C. Here are the risks to those different, items, and you can either accept it or, mitigate this somehow.
Yeah, this is Marshall. Can I add a comment to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah, I totally agree with the evaluation comments. The only other thing I would add to this, and we see this in a lot of the customers that we do business with, and that is many customers, particularly financial services again, will perform risk self-assessments as part of their operational risk management program, and they'll do those self-assessments on a quarterly basis or at least an annual basis, where they're asking business unit managers to reaffirm their business processes and their risks and controls and whether their controls are operating during that period. Often they use that information for rolling up or Sarbanes-Oxley or other financial reporting purposes. My point is that many of these organizations are adding a step to that self-assessment where they have the business unit declare that the suppliers that they're doing business with, and or they're picking up that information through the business continuity plans of the organization, where the business unit manager should be identifying their critical suppliers to continue their business operations on an ongoing basis. So I think those are a couple of other ideas for picking up suppliers when you don't necessarily have a fully codified process for them going through procurement.
It's probably a good segue to my next question, which is going to be for John. I mean, the idea of assessment overload, I think it can affect vendors as well as the suppliers, especially on the evaluation side. John, I know you've got some thoughts on what are some of the things you're seeing companies implement to make that part of the process more efficient?
Yeah, this is a really big one, both internal workload on assessment and certainly to the externally facing to the supplier or vendor. I've seen some that are hundreds of questions long, regardless of the size or the type of work being proposed by the supplier. Additionally, suppliers have been having to answer the questionnaires multiple times for various engagements with the same client. So it's a lot of redundancy, certainly on the supplier side, but internally as well. So a tool like Archer can really help with that. You can have a master library of all of the possible questions that you want to use or have available to you. What we typically do, and we've done it with RBC and a couple of other clients, is do at a bare bones what we call a triage questionnaire or a preliminary risk questionnaire, and it's a small number of questions. 20-ish would be suitable. You're really trying to get a flavor of what type of work there is, and at a very high level, what risk might there be, and then using that, you might generate a more detailed risk assessment using only the questions that are related to the output of this triage or preliminary questionnaire. So, as an example, the triage questionnaire might ask, what types of information are you sharing with the supplier? If you're only sharing publicly accessible information, privacy risk may not be in scope for you there. If you're sharing client information or medical information or anything like that, obviously you're going to want to know more about the third party's privacy controls and any of their suppliers, the fourth and fifth party controls, if it's applicable. So that's one way to really cut it down. Is really only ask the questions that you really need to ask. And have some of these assessments a little bit more integrated. Quite often there's a lot of overlapping questions, duplicate questions, because IT wants to know something and privacy wants to know something and business continuity wants to know something. Formulate the questions so that you're asking really the information one time. The tool can share it to whomever you want on the back end and through multiple ways. But that will reduce a lot of the headache up front, certainly. And as it was mentioned earlier, there's third-party data sources out there that can help with some of this information. I don't know that you'd want to rely on them solely, but you can certainly enhance your information. So the Dun & Bradstreet, Reuters, that type of stuff will certainly get some summary information for you there. And it's probably already been analyzed and with some kind of rating on it as well. Another thing that we're looking at, and we're in a unique position at Iceberg, we're looking at building a portal environment where the supplier assessments can be completed and fed into the client solution. And the win here is that you're not granting these external suppliers access directly into your infrastructure. If it's a small organization and you want, your 5, 10, 15 suppliers coming in, that's one thing. Companies the size of RBC and Aetna, they can have tens of thousands potentially. You're not going to be letting them in past your firewall. So that's a challenge. How do you get suppliers to fill out your risk assessments inside your tool? So we're working on an initiative right now to allow that, and we're in the early phases of that, building it in our lab environment. That will help some of the workload there.
Okay, thanks, John. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to get some more audience questions in. This one, maybe I'll direct it at Darren about the size of your team. How big is your group? I'll let you answer that one.
Sure. So our group, Supplier Management and Governance Group, is a team of 10 that has an enterprise view of the third-party risk. However, we are only a piece of the puzzle. When you factor in all the different groups that we have, the privacy group, the IT risk, business continuity, and a few others, there are 13 other centers of governance that all play a role in supplier risk. And our role is to help bring those together. So yes, we are a small team, but we're not expected to do all the heavy lifting. We rely heavily on other centers of governance to help us achieve this as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Mohammed for that question. Jonathan, I'll direct this question from Rob to you. How do you decide the time frame between assessments? Maybe a quick answer to that one if you can.
Yeah, so, I mentioned our segmentation earlier. That directs, it's based on risk and value. Where they fall into the segment will direct how often certain assessments or, certain campaigns will be launched for those suppliers.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, so we work in the same fashion. Where we're headed is the next layer on that for us is actually looking at the actual risk with a specific engagement. So we've segmented the suppliers, we've done a triage to that engagement, and based on an outcome of that, it's either annual or it's every 3 years, depending on that risk base. But even within those, if we have a truly high-risk, quote-unquote, material engagement, we're looking at potentially making that reassessment happen more frequently, particularly if it's due to a financial or an IT risk. We want to make sure we stay on top of that as well.
It is Marshall. If I could add a comment. Yeah, so in my past life, when I worked for a financial institution, we did our risk assessments on an inherent and residual basis. So if we had a critical supplier that was, say, critical to the strategy of the organization or was providing some kind of critical operational support and they had a weak financial wherewithal, that is, their financial statements were at the level that they could go out of business any day, we produced a watch list on a quarterly basis to make sure that we had contingency plans in place around those third parties that we could pull up on a moment's notice. So, yeah, the higher the inherent risk, the more frequent the time frame for a review.
We are coming up on the end of our hour. We could talk about this for another hour, I'm sure. Maybe we'll have to do a sequel sometime. But I do want to thank our panelists, Darren, Jonathan, Marshall, and John, as well as everyone who tuned in to listen to the discussion. If you have additional questions for the panelists, we'd be happy to take them and direct them their way. You can email info@icebergnetworks.com, and our team would also be happy to set up a demo of the RSA Archer solution as well for you. I'll be posting a copy of the deck on our website as well as a video recording you can share with colleagues. That'll be up later this afternoon at icebergnetworks.com/SRM. And with that, thanks again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.